Hello and welcome to today's Energy Chat, brought to you by the energycollective.com, the moderated forum of the world's best commentary on and analysis on energy policy, climate change, renewable energy, and energy innovation. For the Energy Collective, I'm your host, Jesse Jenkins, and today I'm delighted to chat with award-winning filmmaker Robert Stone, the director of the new documentary Pandoras Promise, which began showing in select cities last Friday after making a big splash at this year's Sundance Film Festival. Pandora's Promise poses a controversial question. Does nuclear power, the one energy technology we often fear the most, have the potential to save our planet from climate catastrophe while providing the energy needed to lift billions of people in the world out of poverty? The film, which I viewed at a screening in Cambridge recently, focuses on the personal stories of 5 longtime environmentalists who each began their journeys as anti-nuclear or nuclear skeptics, only to find themselves challenging their prior beliefs and reevaluating their positions on nuclear energy as they engaged more with the risks posed by various energy technologies and the global energy challenges faced this century. It's a conversion process that Stone hopes the film itself will spark in its audience, as the film attempts to confront several of the most common reasons nuclear power is so often feared and viscerally opposed. We're also joined today in this conversation by Michael Shellenberger, one of the film's protagonists and the president and co-founder of the Breakthrough Institute, an independent progressive think tank known for its often unorthodox views on energy, climate change, and other issues. Robert, Michael, thanks both of you for joining us for this Energy Chat.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Jesse.
So Robert, let's begin with you. You began your filmmaking career with the Academy Award-nominated film Radio Bikini, which focused on the devastating testing of the atomic bomb in the South Pacific. And now your latest film returns to the atom, but from a decidedly different position, addressing how civilian nuclear energy might address some of our key energy and climate challenges. So how did you decide to make this film? Kind of walk us through the path from Radio Bikini to Pandora's Promise.
Well, I think like a lot of people, you know, my default position was that I was anti-nuclear because I was anti-nuclear weapons and still am and always will be. So my abhorrence of nuclear weapons got sort of carried over to an abhorrence of nuclear power, but I didn't really think much beyond that. And the inspiration to make the film was really, I think, ultimately came out of being a dad and becoming increasingly alarmed about climate change and the fact that the 3 main pillars upon which the environmental movement had kind of staked or any sort of ability to combat it were all failing, which is the idea that energy efficiency would somehow reduce overall demand, the idea that we were going to have raise the price on energy through either a carbon tax or some kind of global agreement on reducing CO2 emissions, and the idea that wind and solar alone are going to somehow displace fossil fuels. All those things have failed over the last 25 years, so I, like a lot of other environmentalists, including Michael, are starting to think outside the box and about what we do about this, and that kind of led us to reevaluating nuclear power.
And what is it about nuclear power, Robert, that you think can succeed where some of those other strategies that you mentioned might be falling short on climate mitigation?
Well, I think the key issue is scalability. I mean, if you look at the countries that have been able to really dramatically reduce CO2 emissions, the only countries that have done that have deployed nuclear power. No country has actually done that yet with renewables alone. So, although actually Brazil is an exception to that. Brazil's doing an amazing work at reducing CO2 emissions through, but it's through biofuels, and they're slashing the Amazon to do that. Mm-hmm. And they're damming up every tributary into the Amazon that they can get their hands on. So neither of those approaches are particularly environmentally friendly.
So, Michael, I mentioned deforestation as a key issue. I know you began a lot of your work on forest preservation issues and have yourself taken quite a long journey from an anti-nuclear position to a self-professed nuclear convert and advocate these days. So why don't you give readers a sense of the journey that you've taken to becoming pro-nuclear, that is self-documented in the film, but for those who haven't seen it yet, walk us through from your efforts as an environmental campaigner working to protect the last California redwoods to appearing in this film and working to make the case in favor of nuclear energy.
Well, it was gradual. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
It was gradual. I mean, I had some friends come up to me after the San Francisco screening of the movie, and they were like, I didn't change my mind in like 90 minutes, but I'm really rethinking this. And I think that's sort of should be our attitude towards the movie, too, is that for me it took years, really. And it was, I think it starts, you know, probably in the early 2000s even, when you just started to get a sense that dealing with climate change was going to be a big shift in how we produce energy. But it really, you know, during that period, we were focused on a big crash program on renewables, the Apollo Alliance, and you know, big 300 billion investment in solar and wind. And then I think as the years went on, and we started to see how limited what solar and wind could do, you know, and also I think getting over a lot of our somewhat irrational fears about nuclear, that we started to feel like if you're really going to make a dent in emissions, you got to use nuclear. And I think, you know, it was really, I think it was, you know, it was a couple of people in particular, Stuart Brand, kind of arguing with us, and Mike Lind, and then of course we were all just sort of reading more and more about the various energy technologies you needed, until you finally went, obviously nuclear is going to be a big part of this.
And so that's sort of visceral, that, you know, elicits a sort of visceral fear of nuclear power, so that even if, you know, I was convinced or others were convinced by the case that it's a low carbon energy source, is it worth the risks involved? What, you know, whether it's nuclear waste that lasts for tens or hundreds of thousands of years, or the risk of radiation in the case of a meltdown like Fukushima. Robert, how does the film hope to directly address and counteract all of those concerns and turn its audience into nuclear converts?
Well, you know, the film sort of walks us through all of the various objections to nuclear power, which, like you say, I mean, waste is obviously a big one that we were all concerned about. I mean, should I go point by point? I mean, the waste issue, it turns out that there's really very little of it. And I know a lot of people talk about mountains of waste, or talk about gallons of waste like it's all in liquid form and can leach out everywhere. Turns out the stuff is stored pretty well in these dry cask storage containers around the country. And there's very little of it. We do a graphic in the film where we demonstrate that if you took all of the nuclear waste in the country and put it in together in one space, and obviously you couldn't do this actually because you need to keep it separate, but if you could actually put it together in a physical space, it would fill a single football field stacked about 8 feet high. Like, that's all there is, which is pretty shocking. And that's after, you know, 50 years of running commercial nuclear power plants. And then the amount of high-level waste, the stuff that's radioactive for 100,000 years that we've all been worried about, the so-called, you know, toxic legacy and all that would only fill up to the 1 yard line on this football field. So first of all, there's very little of it, and then the promise of these next generation reactors, which we all know how to make, would use this waste as fuel. We only use about 3% of it in conventional reactors, 3% of the energy. So this waste is an incredible resource that single football field that I talked about could power everything in the United States, including the transportation sector, at current energy levels for 1,000 years. So we'd never need to mine uranium again. So that's just the waste issue. But we won't march through all of the objections, including the safety thing. Maybe Michael would want to address some of these other things too.
Yeah, Michael, I know that, you know, you followed closely the nuclear meltdowns at the power plant at Fukushima, and actually it was one of the more dramatic moments in the film where Robert, you, and Mark Linus, one of the other environmentalists that appears in the film, actually traveled to the Fukushima exclusion zone where residents are no longer allowed to return. How do you confront, Michael, the image of, you know, Fukushima and the displacement of, you know, really tens of thousands of people from their homes due to the meltdowns there, and still come out of this as a pro-nuclear advocate?
Well, it's not easily. I mean, I think the movie does a good job of showing that anybody who doesn't kind of rethink being pro-nuclear after Fukushima is either not thinking or is not feeling, because it was a terrible experience, and still is a huge problem. And, you know, I think the other thing, you know, it's worth saying, not in any way to dismiss it, but I think we do have the two, I think, and certainly I think the Japanese have the tsunami and the meltdown kind of all wrapped together. I mean, it was just 20,000 people got killed right away. And then they go into
by the tsunami.
By the tsunami, yeah. And then they go and have a nuclear meltdown that lasts for weeks and is quite terrifying. Now, you know, it looks like now, you know, that the U.S. knew that there wouldn't be some chain reaction where the other plants would somehow be abandoned and fail, as one of the scenarios was. But that kind of alarmist thinking, I think, is understandable in that circumstance. So I think it does raise really big questions. I mean, I think for us, I think, you know, it has been a motivation to get more serious about what innovation looks like for nuclear. You know, so if we're going to say that we need to make solar and wind cheap and scalable, and we need cheap backup storage, and we need to have innovation for nuclear as well. And high on that list, I think, is safety. I think higher than with the waste issue, for example, which I agree with Robert is a kind of overblown. The safety issue is very real, and so I think one of the exciting things that the movie describes is that we've been doing research on better designs. One of the bad things is that we cut that R&D in the early 90s, and in that way, you know, we liberals and environmentalists are really were responsible for that. And then I think, you know, what the movie doesn't show, but you've seen some of the press coverage around the movie, like that great, there's 2 articles in the New Yorker, one that was this great review of Robert's movie, and then the other that describes all the innovation that's happening with advanced designs. You know, Leslie Dewan, who's there with you at MIT, Jesse, is just one, you know, young entrepreneur who's doing some very exciting stuff. But, you know, the Chinese are by far doing the most, as we've been seeing. So I think for us, Fukushima was both, you know, on the one hand, you know, an acknowledgement that even when things go terribly wrong, you can still prevent people from getting a dangerous dose of radiation, and that's pretty exciting. You know, but it also was a reminder that in order to do that, you have to have mass evacuation that imposes huge hardships on people, which just leads you to conclude that we just have got to be developing those next generation designs, and to some extent already we have a better design in the AP1000, you know, which already has a passive safety protection.
The AP1000 are the new Westinghouse reactors that are under construction in Georgia and in China.
Yeah, they can have a loss of coolant, and they have water above the reactors that can then keep the reactor cool for 3 days, is my understanding, which is plenty of time to get other water there. So there's a long-winded way of saying Fukushima was both a reminder that it's amazing how few people die even when things go terribly wrong, and a motivation to developing these next generation technologies.
Thanks. So I have a couple questions that were sent in from our Energy Collective community via Twitter earlier today. Christy Gogan asks, what's the biggest challenge in shifting public perception on nuclear power? And Robert Wilson similarly asked, how important or difficult is shifting public perceptions of risk for nuclear power to expand significantly? So maybe, Robert, I'll start with you. What kind of reaction are you getting from folks in the audience as you come around, you know, at some of the various screenings that you've done of the film? What seems to be the biggest challenge in moving people's perceptions on this issue?
Well, I've been just really amazed at how people's perceptions have shifted, because if you say on most issues, people are pretty locked in to their views. And you'd think on an issue that's as contentious as this, that would, you know, that would be as rigid as all these other things. And it's fact that's actually not proven to be the case. I think, as I said before, you know, being anti-nuclear is kind of a default position if you're a Democrat or liberal. You know, it's just part of the program without giving it really, you know, much more thought than that. So it's a very broad-based sort of conviction, but it's actually very thin. I mean, it's a very thick among, you know, hardcore anti-nuclear activists. But for most of the general public, it's just a default position. And what I found is the film's been incredibly persuasive, and we've shifted, you know, vast majorities of the audiences coming our way when they come out of the film, including people who are, you know, audiences that are packed with environmental activists who are, very concerned about climate change and are realizing that things are really trending the wrong way, and that coal remains, the most widely used source of energy, the fastest growing source of energy, and CO2 emissions are higher than they've been in all of human history and are accelerating, and that we need some new thinking. So, what I've sensed is that this film, it's almost like a breath of fresh air. It's like, oh, thank God, we can actually talk about this now. We can talk about nuclear. Like, it's always kind of in the back, but we couldn't go there. So it's gotten people excited and wanting to know more. We couldn't answer every question in 90 minutes, and like some of the criticisms, like, well, what did you deal with this, or you didn't answer absolutely every possible question about nuclear power. My purpose was not to answer every question in 90 minutes. My purpose was to get the conversation going, particularly among people who really care the most about this. So, like I said, I've been surprised. If you read the media coverage of the whole thing in the last few weeks, I think we've really changed the conversation permanently. I mean, nuclear is on the table now in any rational discussion about climate change. Nuclear is back on the table. People are talking about it. Environmentalists are talking about it. People who have been opposed to nuclear their whole life are talking about it. And, it remains to be seen where we go with this. But I think we've put it on the table now.
Yeah, and judging by the amount of debate going on, you've certainly started the conversation quite effectively. Christy also asked a related question, which is sort of good follow-up here. How significant is opposition of mainstream environmentalists to scaling up nuclear energy in the West? And I assume by that she means the United States, Europe, et cetera. So Michael, I know you've spent a lot of time considering that question. I'm curious, how much is this film directed at mainstream environmentalists, committed environmental activists, or how much of it is sort of an attempt to go around that audience and sort of make a direct appeal to a broader public that might not be as versed in these issues? How do you sort of see the process of convincing folks? Are environmentalists in opposition a problem here that you need to change or move their position on to make nuclear go forward?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that Robert's idea and sort of ours too is that you already have half the country that's mostly pro-nuclear. They tend to be conservative. They tend to be Republican. So there's a smaller minority, I think, of Democrats, liberals, and environmentalists who are pro-nuclear. So those are the folks that we definitely want to be talking to say, hey, take another look at this technology, which has been really unfairly maligned, and it has huge potential to be a very important technology to power the world without a lot of negative environmental consequences. And I think the movie's had a huge impact too. I mean, I think it's funny because it's just like a year or two ago where, and more recently even, people were saying that 1 million people died at Chernobyl and that all this toxic waste was causing cancer. All this nuclear waste was causing cancer and radiation, kind of wild stories about radiation. And I think those mostly disappeared. I mean, except for the most ardent anti-nuclear activists, I didn't see much of that reaction as much to the movie. The main reaction people had was just around cost. But nuclear is really expensive. And I think, as Robert said, if we can have a conversation about cost, we've already made a lot of progress, because then we're out of the realm of the irrational, and we're talking about something that's rational and you can have a conversation about. And I think, the challenge for environmentalists is just, letting room for nuclear means maybe holding more lightly the idea of a renewables world. In other words, I don't think any of us are saying that we don't want to deploy a lot of solar and a lot of wind. It's just that we also need to do a lot of nuclear, and being against nuclear, whether it's deployment or its development, is undermining what really ought to be our highest environmental priority. And I think that is having a big... what was exciting was to see film critics, being exposed to this material, people who have really only been exposed to the other side of it for really decades.
Yeah, you mentioned the renewables issue. So many of the debates about nuclear power online, including at our site at the Energy Collective, sometimes devolve into a nuclear versus renewables kind of pissing match. So what is it about the pro-nuclear and pro-renewables crowds that seems so mutually opposed at times? Robert, and I'm curious sort of how you see the film situating itself in relation to some of those debates. How do you come down on the nuclear versus renewables, or both and, kind of conversations?
Well, that's a key question. I mean, I think a lot of folks in the environmental movement have kind of confused the means with the ends. I mean, solar and wind are the means to, zero CO2 emissions. They are not an end in itself. And I really couldn't give a damn if we powered the world on algae. I've got no dog in this race about nuclear. It's simply another means to the end of getting to zero CO2 emissions as quickly as possible. So it's not an either or thing to me. I think we're going to need lots of wind, lots of solar, lots of anything else that somebody can dream up. But we need to work with the technology that we've got available to us right now, because the climate scientists who I trust on this are saying we've got very little time. So what do we have available to us? So I think this split of either or is and winner take all is really an outgrowth of this mistaking the means with the ends.
Michael, I don't know if you want to weigh in on that.
No, I mean, I think it gets at really deep cultural issues. I mean, people really do love the idea of a society powered gracefully, is the language that gets used, by wind and sun, and I think to the point about the West that was raised, I think that where this stuff is really happening are in places where people are trying to just get base load, cheap grid electricity to their people, namely China. I don't know if you saw the big Sunday Times piece about all the, how many huge mega cities there are going to be in China. And I think the movie does a really good job of showing how powering all this civilization, all these cities, requires, a lot of base load power, and it requires grid electricity. And I think that is not I think that's not the romantic vision that a lot of people have of the future. And I think the movie's saying, it can be a very beautiful world, but we have to power it without creating emissions. I think to the other point was just, I think that obviously, I think in the West, where our energy growth is a lot less, this is now a more wonky point. We're going to see probably not nearly as much nuclear deployment as you will in other countries, though I think what's interesting is the possibility that we might be, in the future, bringing back some of those advanced nuclear technologies from the places that they get deployed, like China.
That might be an interesting development. So you think that potentially the developing world or emerging economies become the test beds for next generation nuclear reactors, and then 10 or 20 years down the line, we might be building those here in the United States?
Yeah, and I mean, that's not to say that I think we shouldn't, obviously, like we all, the movie, and obviously we want to see the United States do it too. We don't want to just be like, oh, okay, China's got it taken care of, but I mean, that is definitely where the action is at right now.
Could I say something about the cultural aspect? Because I think this is really important. I think a lot of people look at nuclear and what they look at what we're saying, and they say, they see a vision of a world as it is, but without CO2 emissions, and that doesn't excite them. They want to. Right. They see climate change as a wake-up call to actually change the world, and I think that's a mistake, because with nuclear power, there actually is an incredibly positive, wonderful vision of a world without mountaintop renewable, without oil refineries, without energy poverty, without hydrofracking, without lack of water resources. All of these kind of things actually are part of a positive vision. But I think much of the environmental movement has been wedded since the early 70s to this idea of a world powered by the wind and the sun, which is a very romantic vision and one that I believed in for a long time. But it's been undermined by the realities of climate change, the realities of the developing world, the massive amount of energy we need, the reality that we keep finding more and more fossil fuels. We're not running out. And so these things have kind of undermined the basic premise, the basic romantic premise, which I share, shared, of a world powered by wind and solar. But I think that gets to a lot of on an emotional level, of why some people have a hard time with this.
So do you think people need to then leave behind a renewables only dream if they're going to effectively try to tackle both climate change and global development to supply energy for a planet of 9 or 10 billion people?
Well, I think, in talking to people, there's a lot of people who say that's not a world I want to live in. I don't want to live in a world with 9 billion people who are living high energy lives. I don't want to live in a world powered by nuclear power plants. And there's an apocalyptic streak in that that they want to do it. It's my way or the highway, and that's not solving the problem. So what I find so wonderful about the people in Pandora's Promise is that they're stepping back from looking at these details about how we get to this better world, and saying, well, what are the tools we have available right now, without saying, without it being focused on wind, without being focused on solar, without actually it being focused on nuclear. I don't think anybody in the film, except for the scientists I interviewed, are wedded to nuclear power. Like I say, it's just a means to an end. And if we could power the world with algae, I'm sure Michael will be the first to step up and say, let's do that.
I like the algae research. I like it. It's good stuff.
So it's about keeping open-minded and considering all the tools at our disposal, including nuclear energy, as we try to confront these challenges.
Yeah, we have to. The climate crisis is not going to be solved by a small cadre of committed Greens saying we got to do it this way or to hell with you. Which is, we've got to talk to each other. We've got to build coalitions. We've got to expand our minds and think of when things, look at what works, look at what doesn't work, and constantly. One great line by Stewart. It's not in the movie, but it's something he said, is he wakes up every morning and asks, what am I wrong about? And I think that's a great way to approach this issue. We've got to constantly see what's working, what's not working, and adjust our priorities accordingly.
So, Michael, maybe where does this go from here? The film's out. It started the conversation. What are the next steps?
Well, we're gonna Breakthrough's gonna put out a white paper in a few weeks that kind of says, if we want to make nuclear cheap, here's the stuff that we need to worry about. But I think kind of beyond kind of policy, I think there is a movement here. I mean, there is a set of folks who have come together to say this. I mean, I'm always tribalism aside, it's nice to see people that appreciate the role that nuclear can play, speaking out and coming together. I mean, the Facebook page that I'm on is wild with all sorts of folks from all around the world who want to show Robert's movie and want to kind of have this conversation. I think it'd be great at some point to see a sort of a new organization and a new movement on this, someone to really bring all those people together, because I do think you have advocacy for solar, you have advocacy for wind, and really it's just been left to the utilities and the nuclear industry to make the case for the technology. And I think we need civil society to speak out on this. So I think it's an exciting time. I'm hoping to see much more movement on it in the months and years to come.
Would you hope to see the the mainstream environmental organizations, the Sierra Club or Natural Resource Defense Council or EDF, become pro-nuclear the same way that they're pro-solar or wind today?
I would love that, but I don't think that's going to happen. That's part of the reason I think it's like sometimes it's too much to ask that the older institutions embrace the new paradigm. So I'm hoping that somebody and that many people emerge to sort of make this case in new organizations, because I don't think it's going to happen in the mainstream environmental groups.
Robert, how about you?
Yeah, if you look at the mainstream environmental groups, almost all of them sort of came of age in the 1970s when these ideas were first put forth about powering a world with wind and solar and reducing our energy consumption, and in a world that was where the existential threat was a nuclear war with the Soviet Union, and we were rapidly running out of fossil fuels, which the energy crisis of the 70s was an example of. So that's the paradigm out of which all these environmental groups came of age, and I think their donor base is very much wedded to those ideas. as is the leadership. So I agree with Michael. I think it's, one of the things that excites me about this film has been the reaction of younger people who, their existential threat that's hung over their lives is climate change. They're not afraid of technology. The Cold War is ancient history. And they got a new set of concerns, a new set of priorities, and they're really open to this idea. So they've got to be the ones to go out and start new environmental organizations that are more in tune with the challenges of the 21st century and less attuned to the challenges of the 20th.
Well, I think we'll leave it there. Robert, where can folks catch the film?
Go on to our website, pandoraspromise.com, and you'll see a list of theaters where it's playing. It'll be on CNN in November, and it'll be available on iTunes and Netflix and everywhere on DVD and everywhere else all over the world in December.
Great. The film is Pandora's Promise. So we've been speaking with Robert Stone, the filmmaker and director of the film, as well as Michael Shellenberger of the Breakthrough Institute, who appears in the film as one of its 5 protagonists. Thanks both of you for speaking with the energycollective.com and myself. It's been a great conversation. And I hope everybody out there catches the film. And you may not agree with everything in it, but you should definitely check it out. And as Stuart Brand says, consider what you might be wrong about. So thanks, guys, for joining us.
Thanks, Jesse.